The Warden of Roanoke. The story of the vanished colony of Roanoke has haunted historians, explorers, and storytellers for centuries. But for me, it became something far more than a tale whispered around campfires or written in dusty old books. It became a dark obsession, something that clung to me like a shadow, consuming my every thought until it led me down a path I can never return from. This is my story. A story that will make your skin crawl and your heart race. But be warned, once you start listening, you may not be able to stop, even when the terror becomes unbearable. It all began when I stumbled upon a forgotten journal, tucked away in the basement of a crumbling library in New York. The journal belonged to John White, the leader of the Roanoke colony, and it contained entries that had never been published, entries that spoke of strange occurrences on the island before his departure. My curiosity was piqued, and soon I found myself on a plane to North Carolina, determined to uncover the truth. When I arrived on Roanoke Island, I was struck by how serene it seemed, almost too serene. The dense forests, the salty breeze from the sea, the soft whisper of leaves. It all felt like a facade, hiding something far more sinister beneath. I rented a small cabin near the supposed location of the lost colony, close enough to the site but isolated enough to conduct my research undisturbed. The locals were friendly, though they were quick to change the subject whenever I brought up the Roanoke mystery. It was as if they knew something, but were too afraid to speak. This only fueled my determination. I spent the first few days exploring the island, mapping out the area based on the descriptions in White's journal. I found remnants of the settlement, just as the history books described. Nothing but decayed wood and scattered stones, with that infamous word, Croatoan, etched into a tree. But then on the fourth night, something happened that I can't quite explain. I was reviewing my notes by the dim light of a lantern when I heard it. A faint whisper, carried by the wind. So soft I almost dismissed it as my imagination. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, and unmistakably human. "Help me!" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was coming from outside, near the edge of the woods. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the night, the cool air prickling my skin. The woods were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. I called out, but no one answered. As I ventured deeper into the trees, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, I noticed something strange. The forest floor was littered with odd symbols carved into the earth, like markings from some ancient ritual. I recognized some of them from John White's journal, symbols he had mentioned seeing before he left for England, symbols he had described as warnings. Then I saw it, just ahead, something pale and ghostly, hanging from a low branch. I approached slowly, my heart in my throat. As the beam of light fell on it, I realized with a sickening lurch what it was. A piece of cloth, tattered and stained with dark, dried blood. But it wasn't just any cloth. It was part of a dress, the kind worn by the colonists. And it wasn't alone. Scattered around the area were more pieces, shreds of clothing, fragments of human bones, all leading to one central spot. In the center of the clearing was a shallow grave, freshly dug. I could see the disturbed earth, the loose soil. And just beside it, half buried in the dirt, was an old, weathered skull, its empty eye sockets staring up at me. Suddenly the air grew cold, unnaturally cold. My breath formed misty clouds in the air as I turned to leave. But then I saw it. Movement in the shadows. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, the figure was gone. I ran back to the cabin, heart pounding, mind racing with questions. Who had been in the woods with me? Was it a local trying to scare me off, or something else? And what did those symbols mean? But the most disturbing question of all was the one I couldn't shake. Had I just found the final resting place of one of the vanished colonists? That night I barely slept. My dreams were filled with images of the skull, the symbols, and that figure in the woods. When I woke, the first light of dawn barely piercing the sky, I made a decision. I had to dig deeper, both literally and figuratively. Something terrible had happened on this island, and I was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. But as I prepared to return to the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever was out there in the woods knew I was getting closer, and that it wouldn't let me leave the island alive. The morning after my discovery in the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air in the cabin felt thick, almost oppressive, and the constant sense of being watched gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Despite my growing unease, I knew I had to go back to the clearing. I needed answers. I packed my gear, shovel, camera, flashlight, and set out just as the sun began its ascent, casting long shadows over the island. The woods seemed darker than they should have been, the canopy above blocking out much of the light. As I walked, I kept expecting to see that figure again, lurking just beyond the tree line. But the forest remained eerily silent. When I reached the clearing, Everything was as I had left it. The symbols carved into the ground, the fragments of clothing and bone, and that shallow grave. My heart raced as I approached it, the shovel feeling heavy in my hands. I hesitated for a moment, fear gripping me, but I knew there was no turning back. I began to dig, the sound of the shovel cutting through the earth echoing in the quiet. As the minutes passed, the hole grew deeper, and so did my dread. The soil was loose, almost as if someone or something had been there recently. With every scoop of dirt, I felt the weight of the island's history pressing down on me, the ghosts of the past whispering in my ears. Then, the shovel hit something solid. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I knelt down, carefully brushing away the remaining dirt, revealing what lay beneath. My hands trembled as the object came into view. A small wooden box, worn and weathered by time. It was crudely made, its lid sealed shut with a thick layer of wax. There were more of those symbols carved into the wood, just like the ones in the journal and on the ground around me. I hesitated, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Whatever was inside this box, I knew it wasn't meant to be found. But I couldn't stop now. I had come too far. With shaking hands, I pried the lid open. The wax cracked and crumbled away, and as the lid lifted, a foul stench filled the air, causing me to gag. Inside the box was a bundle of old, yellowed parchment tied with a piece of leather. I carefully unwrapped it, my eyes scanning the faded ink. It was a map, an old hand-drawn map of the island. But this wasn't just any map. It showed a network of tunnels beneath the surface, winding their way through the island like a labyrinth. At the center of the map was a symbol, a spiral surrounded by strange glyphs, and written in the margins, in what I assumed was John White's handwriting, were the words, "Beware the Warden." Asterisk. I had no idea what it meant, but I felt a chill run down my spine. The Warden? Was that who or what I had seen in the woods? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Suddenly I heard a rustling behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding, but saw nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange, a faint glimmer on the ground, just at the edge of the clearing. I approached cautiously, the map still clutched in my hand. It was a necklace, partially buried in the dirt, a small silver locket tarnished with age. I reached down to pick it up, and as my fingers closed around it, a deafening shriek pierced the air. I stumbled back, the locket slipping from my grasp. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. Inhuman, filled with pain and rage. It seemed to come from all around me, as if the very island itself was screaming. Panicked, I grabbed the locket and fled, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that place. The shriek echoed in my ears, growing louder, closer, until I was sure whatever was making that sound was right behind me, ready to drag me down into the earth. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the open, the sound stopped abruptly. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling. The locket was still clutched in my hand, its surface warm to the touch, almost as if it were alive. I stumbled back to the cabin, the day now shrouded in dark clouds that seemed to mirror my growing fear. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and bolted it, the sense of dread creeping back into my mind. What had I uncovered? What had I awoken? I sat at the table, the map spread out before me, the locket resting beside it. I had thought I was searching for answers, but now I felt like I had opened a door that should have remained closed. The map, the locket, the symbols, they all pointed to something far older and darker than I had ever imagined. As I stared at the map, trying to make sense of it, the cabin suddenly grew cold, the temperature dropping so rapidly that my breath became visible. The lights flickered, and then, just for a moment, they went out completely. When they came back on, I wasn't alone. Standing in the corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, was a figure. A tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a face twisted in a grimace of rage. His clothes were tattered, stained with dirt and blood, and his skeletal hand was pointing directly at me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even scream. The figure took a step forward, then another, his presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of malice. As he drew closer, I could see his mouth moving, but no sound came out. Just the silent, agonized plea of a lost soul. And then as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The cabin was empty, the temperature slowly returning to normal, but the fear remained, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. I looked down at the map, and my blood ran cold. The spiral symbol at the center had changed. It was no longer just a spiral. It had transformed into the shape of an eye, staring up at me from the parchment. And beneath it, written in blood-red ink, were the words, "He sees you, asterisk." The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, its gaze a constant weight on my shoulders. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the old cabin's floorboards sent me into a spiral of terror. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hollow, staring faces in the darkness, felt those cold, bony fingers clutching at my skin. I tried to leave the island. I packed my bags, threw everything into my car, and sped toward the ferry that would take me back to the mainland. But when I arrived, I found the docks deserted, the ferry nowhere in sight. I called for help, but my phone had no signal, and the radio in my car only produced static. It was as if the island itself was holding me captive, refusing to let me escape. Desperate, I drove back to the cabin, my mind racing. I knew that if I stayed, whatever was haunting this place would come for me, but I had no choice. I was trapped, with no way out and no one to help me. The warden's curse had ensnared me, just as it had ensnared the colonists centuries ago. That night, as the wind howled outside and the trees creaked like ancient bones, I sat at the table staring at the map and the locket. The eye symbol on the map seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and the locket felt unnaturally warm in my hand, as if it was alive. I knew that if I wanted to break free, I had to understand the curse, had to find a way to confront the warden and end this nightmare. I opened the locket, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was a tiny scrap of parchment, yellowed with age. The writing was barely legible, but I could make out a few words. The warden comes at the hour of darkness. Only the blood of the marked can break the curse. Asterisk. My blood ran cold as the meaning of those words sank in. The colonists had tried to appease the warden with sacrifices, offering up their own in a futile attempt to escape his wrath. And now, I was the one who was marked. Marked for death, unless I could find a way to end it. But how? How could I possibly fight something as old and powerful as the warden? I was just a man, alone and terrified, with no weapons and no allies. The only thing I had was the map, the locket, and a growing sense of dread. As I sat there, paralyzed by fear, I heard it, a low rumbling sound like thunder rolling across the island. The cabin shook, the windows rattling in their frames. I looked outside, but the night was impenetrable, the darkness thicker than ever before. The rumbling grew louder, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't thunder at all. It was footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the woods, growing closer with every passing second. I could feel the ground trembling beneath me, the air vibrating with a deep, resonant hum. The warden was coming. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. I had to act quickly, had to find a way to stop him before it was too late. I grabbed the map and the locket, and without thinking, I bolted out of the cabin, into the cold, oppressive night. The woods were alive with movement, the trees swaying violently as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I ran blindly, following the map's directions, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the warden's presence all around me, a malevolent force closing in, ready to claim me as his own. The map led me back to the clearing, to the place where I had first found the hatch. But this time there was something different, something new. In the center of the clearing, where the shallow grave had been, there was now a large stone altar, identical to the one I had seen in the chamber below. It was slick with fresh blood, the symbols around it glowing faintly in the darkness. I approached the altar, my hands trembling, the locket clutched tightly in my fist. The rumbling footsteps had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on me from all sides. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay, and I knew that the warden was here, watching me, waiting for me to make my move. The locket seemed to pulse in my hand, the warmth growing stronger, almost painful. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it filled me with dread. I was the marked one, the sacrifice. If I wanted to break the curse, I had to offer my blood. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I stepped up to the altar, the cold stone biting into my skin. The locket felt like it was burning, the heat searing through my flesh. I held it above the altar, my hand shaking. And then, with a surge of determination, I squeezed it tightly, crushing it in my fist. The locket shattered, the metal crumbling away, and in its place was a sharp, jagged shard, glowing with an eerie red light. I knew what I had to do, but the fear was overwhelming, almost paralyzing. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and plunged the shard into my palm. Pain shot through my hand, intense and blinding, but I didn't stop. I held my bleeding hand over the altar, letting the blood drip onto the stone. The symbols around me began to glow brighter, the air humming with energy. I could feel the warden's presence growing stronger, the darkness closing in. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the air was split by a deafening roar, a sound so powerful it shook the very ground beneath me. The altar trembled, the symbols flaring with a blinding light, and then everything went still. For a moment there was nothing but silence. I stood there, breathless and trembling, waiting for the warden to strike, to claim his prize. But nothing happened. The clearing was empty, the darkness receding, the air growing warmer. Had it worked? Had I broken the curse? I stumbled back from the altar, my mind reeling. The locket was gone. the shard dissolved into nothing. My hand throbbed with pain, the blood still dripping from the wound. But there was no sign of the warden, no sign of the malevolent force that had haunted me. And then, just as I allowed myself to hope, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the wind. "You are mine, asterisk." Before I could react, the ground beneath me gave way. The earth opened up, the altar collapsing into a yawning chasm that seemed to stretch into the very depths of hell. I tried to run, tried to escape, but it was too late. The ground swallowed me whole, pulling me down into the darkness, into the abyss. As I fell, the last thing I saw was the eye. The spiral symbol, glowing with a terrible, malevolent light, etched into the walls of the chasm, watching me, mocking me. The warden had not been defeated. The curse had not been broken. I was the sacrifice, and now I was his. Darkness. That was all I knew as I fell deeper and deeper into the earth, swallowed by the gaping maw of the island. The air was thick and oppressive. The silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. My body was in free fall, tumbling through the abyss, my screams lost in the void. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fall ended. I slammed into the ground with bone-jarring force, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I lay there, dazed and disoriented, the taste of blood in my mouth. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't think, as the pain radiated through my body. But then, slowly my senses returned, and I forced myself to sit up. I was in a cavern, its walls slick with moisture, the air cold and damp. The only light came from the faint, sickly glow of the spiral symbols etched into the stone. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, casting eerie shadows that danced across the rough surfaces. The cavern was vast, the ceiling lost in the darkness above, the walls stretching out into the blackness. I knew I was deep beneath the island, far below the tunnels I had explored. This was the heart of the curse, the place where the warden's power was strongest, and I was trapped. As I struggled to my feet, pain shot through my limbs, but I pushed it aside. I had to find a way out, had to escape this nightmare. But as I took my first step, I heard it. The sound that had haunted my every waking moment since I arrived on the island. Footsteps. They echoed through the cavern, heavy and deliberate, coming from all around me. The ground trembled with each step, the air vibrating with that deep, resonant hum. I turned frantically, trying to locate the source, but the shadows seemed to shift and twist, hiding whatever was out there in the darkness. And then I saw him, the warden. He emerged from the shadows, towering over me, his form barely visible in the dim light. He was more monstrous than I had imagined, his body a grotesque amalgamation of human and something far more ancient, far more malevolent. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skeletal frame, his eyes hollow sockets that seemed to burn with an inner fire. His mouth was twisted into a grimace, his teeth sharp and jagged, his long bony fingers ending in claws that scraped against the stone. But it was his eyes, those empty staring eyes that held me frozen in place. They bore into me, stripping away my defenses, exposing my deepest fears. I could feel his gaze like a physical force pinning me to the spot, making it impossible to move, to run. "You have come far!" The warden's voice echoed in my mind, a low guttural growl that reverberated through the cavern. "But you cannot escape your fate, asterisk." I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in the warden's gaze as he slowly advanced toward me. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he relished the terror that gripped me, as if he fed on it. "The others tried to defy me," he continued, his voice growing louder, more menacing. "They thought they could escape my wrath, but they were wrong. They were all wrong." Asterisk. As he spoke, the cavern around me seemed to come alive. The walls shifted, revealing more of the mummified corpses, their hollow eyes staring out from the stone. They were the lost colonists, the ones who had vanished without a trace. They had been dragged down here just as I had been, claimed by the warden's curse, and now they were his servants. "You are the last," the warden hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "The final piece of the puzzle. With your blood, my power will be complete." Asterisk. I could feel the weight of his words, the inevitability of what was to come. I had been marked from the moment I set foot on the island, chosen to be the final sacrifice in a ritual that had spanned centuries. There was no escape, no hope. But then something inside me snapped. A surge of defiance, of anger rose up from deep within. I would not go quietly, would not surrender to this monstrosity. If I was going to die, I would make sure the warden paid for it. With a burst of adrenaline, I broke free from the warden's gaze, the paralysis lifting just enough for me to move. I lunged forward, grabbing the shard of the locket that I had kept hidden in my pocket. The sharp metal cut into my hand as I gripped it tightly, the pain fueling my determination. The warden's eyes flared with anger as he realized what I was about to do. He reached out, his claws slicing through the air, but I was quicker. With all the strength I could muster, I plunged the shard into his chest, driving it deep into his cold, dead flesh. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the warden let out a blood-curdling scream, a sound so loud and piercing it shook the very walls of the cavern. The ground beneath me trembled, cracks spidering across the stone, as the warden's form began to disintegrate, his body crumbling into dust. The cavern was collapsing, the symbols on the walls flaring brightly before fading into darkness. But the warden wasn't finished yet. As his body disintegrated, his eyes, those terrible, hollow eyes, locked onto mine one last time. A twisted grin spread across his face as he spoke, his voice a whisper of pure evil. "You are mine forever." With those final words, the warden's body collapsed into a pile of dust, the cavern around me collapsing in on itself. I turned and ran, the ground crumbling beneath my feet, the walls closing in. I could hear the screams of the colonists, their voices mingling with the warden's laughter, as I raced toward what I hoped was the exit. Just as the last of the light was extinguished, I saw it, a faint glimmer of moonlight shining through a crack in the earth. I threw myself toward it, diving through the opening just as the cavern collapsed behind me, sealing the warden and his curse beneath the island forever. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body shaking with exhaustion and terror. The night was silent, the air still and cold, but I was free. I had escaped the warden's grasp, broken the curse that had haunted the island for centuries. But as I lay there, staring up at the night sky, a chilling realization crept into my mind. The warden's final words echoed in my ears, a whisper that refused to be silenced. "You are mine, forever, asterisk." And then I felt it, a cold, creeping sensation spreading through my veins, a darkness seeping into my mind. The warden's curse hadn't been broken. It had been passed on, to me. I staggered to my feet, my vision blurring, my body growing colder with each passing moment. I could feel the warden's presence inside me, his malevolent spirit taking root, consuming me from the inside out. I was becoming the very thing I had fought against, the new vessel for the warden's wrath. As I stumbled through the woods, I knew that I had only one option left. I had to return to the island, to seal myself within the earth, before the warden could use me to wreak havoc on the world above. It was the only way to prevent the curse from spreading, to stop the cycle of death and terror from continuing. With the last of my strength, I made my way back to the clearing, to the place where it had all begun. The earth was still warm, the crack in the ground still visible. I knew what I had to do. As I stepped into the opening, the darkness closed in around me, the ground swallowing me whole. The last thing I saw before the earth consumed me was the spiral symbol, glowing faintly in the distance, a reminder of the horror that would never end. And then, there was nothing but darkness. I am the warden now, the curse living on through me, waiting for the next to come and claim my place. The island remains, a place of death and despair, a trap for the curious and the brave. And when they come, I will be waiting.